How far should schools go to protect kids from crazed gunmen? Should there be cops in every school, armed guards at the door? Or would you be willing to support the idea of letting teachers, staff members, maybe even students carry guns? Well, it's your call this hour on Armed Teachers, and the debate starts right now. It has happened yet again. An armed intruder made his way into an elementary school, apparently intent on killing as many people as possible. Fortunately, his plans were thwarted, but the frightening incident has once again raised the questions: how do we protect our students from deranged gunmen? Should we have cops at every school, armed guards, or how about armed teachers? Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lynn Doyle, and that is our debate for this hour. We're asking you, should we allow teachers or even students on a college campus to carry weapons to protect against a potential attack? As I mentioned, fortunately, no one was hurt when Michael Brandon Hill allegedly fired an assault weapon inside a Georgia elementary school. But this latest attack, just 8 months after the deadly attack at a Newtown, Connecticut school, once again has parents and teachers reeling. School used to be a place where kids could feel safe, but ever since Columbine back in 1999, that's no longer true. And despite schools' best efforts, horrific attacks like Sandy Hook continue to happen. That's why people like Benjamin Manis supports training school personnel to be armed. He's a public safety and security expert and a former federal and municipal law enforcement officer who now serves on the board of Philadelphia InfraGuard, which is an FBI-coordinated public-private partnership for critical infrastructure protection. Others, though, say that that's not the answer, including Robert Tesoro, who is the president of Safe School Technologies. He's a former director of law enforcement relations for the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for starting our debate.
Thank you.
Obviously, the hot button topic here is the idea of putting guns in the hands of our school teachers or the staff members. So let's start right there, because I know that's going to get the most reaction from the viewers. What's the upside to a proposal like that?
Well, first, there's an issue of denial regarding the two functions that must be completed in order to make schools safer. First is law enforcement, and the second is force protection. Teachers aren't necessarily the first line of defense. It depends on, of course, the size of your district and how many people and how much resources you have. But a lot of law enforcement, school resource officers, school safety officers are out there not completing their mission. And the first mission, obviously, in force protection is to be able to enforce a zero weapon policy. And you can't do that if you do not have a weapon.
Do you advocate arming teachers or school personnel and training them appropriately in addition to other security methods, not a standalone answer?
I think if your school district doesn't have a viable law enforcement entity to provide that service, provide that security service, then other staff members can be considered, but it has to be a very careful system. And what I'd like to model it after is the Federal Flight Deck Officer program that the TSA initiated, where at their own expense, pilots or their carrier's expense are now going through the same screening, training, psychological, and other processes that the federal air marshals go through.
Robert, are you totally opposed to the idea of additional protection on school property, or do you think it should be an individual's choice, a teacher's choice, for example, if he or she wants to be trained and then carry a concealed weapon?
Well, I fully support the idea of a school resource officer, which is a trained member of law enforcement who has additional training outside of what they went through at their police academy. But if we learned anything this week about what happened down in DeKalb, was that the idea of only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with the gun, that got blown out of the water by an unarmed bookkeeper who was able to keep her wits and talk down the shooter and kept it from escalating into a potential deadly situation.
Many people are concerned that if there are additional weapons on a school campus, for example, that it could actually make the violence that occurs there triple or become worse, because you could get, it could be like the OK Corral, essentially, where civilians are just shooting at each other.
Well, one of the arguments, you look at the best trained law enforcement officers around the country. The NYPD has found that in active shooter situations, their officers only hit the target 30% of the time. Those are trained, some of the best officers in the world, they only hit their target 30% of the time. Imagine a teacher in a chaotic situation making life and death situations.
All right, we've given our viewers an opportunity to hear from this side for right now. We're going to ask you to join in our conversation. What do you think? Would you support arming teachers or staff members? Do you think that could lead to a more dangerous situation? And what about on the college level? Do you think that college students should be able to arm themselves as a means of protection? If you want to join in here, these are just a few of the things that we're talking about. We're going to get more into this in just a moment, but you can start to email me directly. I'm at lynn@lynndoyle.net, and you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Now, as I mentioned, this is not just an issue that impacts elementary, middle, or high school. It's a danger on college campuses as well. Take a look at some of these incidents. I'm sure you recall Virginia Tech, 33 dead. Back in 1966, the University of Texas had a shooter. It goes on and on and on over the years if you look there. That's why someone like our next guest is really concerned about the potential of having an incident on a college campus. Robert Falstick is a sophomore at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, where he's the campus leader of the Kutztown University Students for Concealed Carry. And joining us now as well is Deborah D. Rainey, who calls herself the compassionate lawyer. She's a criminal, family law, and general practitioner in Philadelphia. We welcome you both to the conversation. I want to start, I'm going to get to the college aspect in just a second, but I want to talk about this idea of arming civilians, so to speak, who even are trained. You've been trained in weaponry, and you say it's not such an easy thing. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to get trained and I can carry a weapon. Not necessarily the easiest thing to do.
Lynn, before I became a lawyer, I was law enforcement, federal law enforcement, prior to that in the military. I spent 9 months in Desert Storm. I was the platoon sergeant of a 12-man platoon. Mm-hmm. I did my first night shift with an M60. I was trained for 5 years on the M60 before I had to go to Desert Storm. One night I'm doing guard duty. I hear, see, give the necessary halt. Who goes there? No response. I light up the desert. Thank God there was no civilian. There was a camel. I felt bad for shooting the camel, but thank God there wasn't an individual there.
Right.
I say that to say, and to piggyback with my colleague, no matter how well trained you are, when you get into that situation, when you're faced actually with that situation, you don't know how you're going to act. And I was trained. I'm terrified at the notion of even a resource person who's not a full-time law enforcement officer who does this all the time. How's he going to react?
But that's why someone like Robert says if he's well-trained and he would rather be well-trained and take your chances against an alleged attacker than not have any way to defend yourself at all, right?
Absolutely, and that's the big argument that we see on college campuses, is that, okay, for example, with Virginia Tech, the same policies that were in place in Virginia Tech across the country are in place today. So we have this mass shooting that happens in Virginia Tech almost 10 years ago, actually over 10 years ago now, and we don't have any change in policy. We have more restrictive changes where we're saying you can't, bring in knives. You have to have clear backpacks. You have to have a mesh backpack. And there's no actual change in stopping the bad guy from getting in. There's no magnetometers. There's no armed security. There's not even any fencing put up. Doors are open all over the place on college campuses. Anybody can walk in and out. It's open. So to say, oh, well, we're just not going to let anybody be armed. Nobody can defend themselves on this campus. But at the same time, we're not going to stop that deranged psychopath who has a firearm, who's looking to cause the most damage.
See, the question that most people have, and I'm sure at home they're saying the same thing, is like, it seems to me, and I've been covering these things since they first started happening, if somebody wants to get in, they're getting in. I mean, you can have a police officer at the front door. If they're willing to shoot the person or shoot their way through like they did at Newtown at Sandy Hook Elementary, what are you going to do?
Well, we're very fortunate that mass shootings are extremely rare. They account for less than 1% of all firearm deaths in this country. Sure. And on college campuses in particular, they are safer than the rest of the community. There are less violent crimes on
until the
campus.
gunman walks in your classroom.
But it's still
I'm sure the
overall
people
less
at
violent.
Newtown thought that their kids were safe too.
With the situation in DeKalb County yesterday, as well as the statistics that Robert just offered, a lot of that has to do with happenstance and luck. And we have to, as a society, get past this denial. And we do it a lot, not only in colleges, but in K through 12 environments, especially even here in Philadelphia, where you have what's reputed to be one of the most violent school districts in America. Our school police are not armed. Now, we have to get past fixating on the tool on their belt and start looking at proactive and actual measures to secure these institutions. It's not happening right now by saying, well, it doesn't happen a lot, so we shouldn't arm people. And there's a whole legion of people out there right now who believe that if you arm even a police officer in a school, it's creating a pathway to corrections. It's not legitimate, conversation.
We're not stopping to think about what we're talking about. We're not talking about prisons. We're not talking about grocery stores. We're talking about institutions of learning.
That's right.
Elementary, high school, college. If we don't start there with the mind, teach people how to speak to folks. Teach people what to look for. Don't arm them. What, are you kidding me? I don't want to walk into another high school in any city like I do when I go to the prison to visit my clients and feel like I'm walking into a prison. It's ludicrous. And if I feel it at my age, imagine our kids.
Yeah, but we have to get past our feelings and start getting into facts and statistics.
But it's the
and if
feelings that make these guys walk into these institutions with the guns.
Nobody is saying that we're replacing education with armed guards. What we're saying is if a jewelry store, bank, sporting institution, or even a movie theater like the one right across the street from here has armed law enforcement protection, then our kids, which is probably the most valuable resource we have in any community, should have the same level of protection.
On that note, I have to take a quick break. If you'd like to join in and tell us what you think, you can do so by emailing me at lynn@lynndoyle.net. You can also find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We're going to share some of your thoughts right after this. Welcome back to this edition of It's Your Call. I'm Lynn Doyle. We are talking about school shootings and what we can do, if anything, to protect our kids. On one hand, people feel like perhaps there should be more armed guards, police officers, maybe even teachers that have guns at their desk or staff members. On the other hand, other people say, no, we have to change the mentality, the way that we approach this. We want to know what you think. So if you want to join in, you can email me at lynn@lynndoyle.net. We are going to check in with our Facebook in just a second. So if you want to do that, you can find me on Facebook. We're under Lynn, It's Your Call Doyle, and also Lynn Doyle. Now, anytime that you combine the emotionally charged issues of protecting our kids and the use of guns, you get a pretty heated response. And our It's Your Call viewers have not disappointed us. We're going to check in and then get some comments from our guest. Jean says, no, teachers are under enough stress. They don't need to carry a gun. Higher security, even if that means raising taxes on my property. Ed says simply yes. If there were guns in the school, there would not be attacks in the first place. Gunmen do not attack armed innocents. And Bunny says, no, that's not the solution. She disagrees. She says stricter gun laws are needed. Robert, I wanted to bring you into the conversation about that with the stricter gun laws, because every time there's one of these situations that occurs, people always say, well, we have to toughen up the gun laws. People who are proponents of carrying guns often say the laws are in effect and they're working, fairly well.
Well, there's an issue between having the laws on the books and actually enforcing them. Frequently, whenever someone is arrested for a gun crime, okay, they're robbing a bank or they're doing something nefarious, essentially, especially like drug running.
Right.
Allegedly.
Defense lawyer in here.
So those individuals, they get prosecuted to the extent of the activities that they were doing while they were carrying the gun, but frequently the gun crime in itself gets dropped. Or in the case of alleged murderers, the gun crime or the discharge of the firearm, the illegal carry, that is not necessarily prosecuted because there is a greater crime going on.
Right.
And when we look at the people that are perpetrating these crimes, though, the people that are carrying a firearm illegally or the people that are using a firearm for a crime, those aren't the ones that go through the procedure to become licensed or to become concealed carriers.
And everybody always says that. They always say the bad guys don't go through the legal channels to get guns.
But
the
those
facts
aren't the
don't-
ones that are shooting the schools up either.
And that's actually
Let's
not
note
backed
that.
up by facts. Since the Brady background checks went into effect, 2 million people have been
right.
denied buying firearms.
Okay.
So 2
But
million people. But just to go to the point, one of the comments that came in on Facebook, there is no proof that a mass shooter has ever targeted his victims because it was in a gun-free zone. In fact, that's a myth that they only attack gun-free zone. 40% of mass shootings occurred in areas where you could own a gun. So that's just a myth that's being promoted and thrown out there. Gabby Giffords, that was an area where you could own a gun. Fort Hood, everyone had a gun on a military base. That's not a deterrent.
On a military post, they did not have guns. You have to authorize your ammunition. You can't just carry freely on a military post. And everyone knows that, but that's not freely the issue here in reference to gun control laws. You know, I respect the positions and I respect the Brady Law, and that's a law on the book that my associate here says needs to be enforced. And when you defund and don't properly authorize the ATF to do their job, you know, we think about gun control. And the people who advocate gun control are not bad people. You know, there's not this us versus them mentality out there. They're coming from an idealistic place, a good place in their heart. The problem is this. A weapon has a half-life of 120 years. Right now, you look at revolvers from the Spanish-American War that are still on the street, 38s that are still on the street,
Right.
120 years old. We can't have a 120-year solution to a right-now problem, and that's the problem.
I don't think that we're talking about gun control far as gun possession appropriateness. I am all for guns. 10 years in the military, 5 years federal law enforcement. I want my own gun. My partner won't let me have one at home, but I want one. I'm a solo practitioner. Clients pay me in cash, banks close. I'm not too certain I want to walk across the street from my office to the bank with no protection. We're talking about the appropriateness of possession of guns in our institutions of learning, our high schools, our elementary schools, our colleges. Right. That's not gun control. Is it appropriate to have a gun in this place?
Well, let me ask you a question. If that's the case, then would you be in favor of a greater professional law enforcement presence?
Most definitely. Even if I trained in non-lethal weapons tactics 20 years ago, learning how to do takedowns, arm bars, application of pressure points, and the like. Why can't we train our existing forces now to prepare to do that?
Doesn't it always come down to money, though? Doesn't it literally always come down to money that no one wants? They can barely pay the teachers enough, particularly in the inner city schools, where very few of these mass shootings occur, by the way.
Well, you bring up teachers, and that should be the biggest point. The teachers don't want this. The teachers don't want to carry the gun.
So what if the teacher wants to carry?
I was just going to say,
why should we say, oh, well, you know, the rest of the teachers here don't want this, but you're in the most violent school district in Pennsylvania, for Philadelphia, for example. You know, there's that one teacher there that might be ex-military, that might be a former police officer, that might be well-trained in carrying a firearm. Why can't they go through the steps?
Because they didn't take that job to carry a gun. They took the job to teach the kids.
They're not
they didn't
making
take
the
that
step.
job to get shot at.
Understandably, you're
who's
absolutely
coming
right.
through the
Here's
front
the
But you
question.
know, going in with your eyes open, if you're going to be asked to and assigned to an urban school, these are your potentials. Should it exist? Of course
So
not.
Debbie, let me ask you a
come on
question.
now.
Do you have a problem with Robert carrying a concealed weapon on the campus of Kutztown University if he feels that it creates a more safer environment for him?
Less than what I would as a high school teacher or a elementary school teacher.
So a college
campus
student
to me is a little bit different. The only thing I would request, if they're going to allow that, some sort of necessary mandatory training. It's not enough to go in front of a range and shoot at a target a few times. You need to have some psychological training.
what are
you
your
need to be
concerns?
prepared. What's going to happen when you pull that gun and you have to fire that gun? It's a heck of a
Are
lot
you prepared
different.
to do that
No,
if someone came up?
law
Well,
enforcement's not.
but I'm asking him if he's
Yes, ma'am.
prepared to pull the trigger if a gunman walks into your pre-med class.
Well, unfortunately for me, you know, carry's still prohibited on campus, so I wouldn't be able to do that. My best bet is to run and scream, or hope I can get out before everybody else so I don't get killed. Because that's the reality of the situation, is that we can sit here and we can wax philosophically about what's going to happen. Are the police officers, do they feel like they're going to be able to pull the trigger when a gunman comes through the door? And that's an ethical, personal discussion that they have to have with themselves. But that all falls to the floor and falls flat when that gunman actually comes through the door. You know, we can talk until we're blue in the face, and we can be opposite on opposite sides of the fence until we're blue in the face. But the day that somebody actually poses a threat to your life, you're going to wish you had a handgun.
Making that decision for me. Right. Just like we saw yesterday, 2 days ago in DeKalb, that woman didn't have a gun. She disarmed it.
She was lucky.
What if she did have a gun and she started shooting? He had an AK-47 with 500 rounds.
A determined shooter.
That
He
could
did
have
not
killed
made up
half
his mind.
that school.
He did not make up his mind to carry out that attack. A determined
she was
shooter
able to calm him down.
walks into a location shooting his way past. Ask Chestnut and Gibson at the Capitol. And that's the most well-armed, well-policed neighborhood in America. And he walked in and killed 2 police officers on his way to DeLay's office.
On that note, I have to take another quick break. I have a big question. How did this guy get an AK-47, and why is it available to these people? We're going to take a break, and we'll be back with more of your thoughts right after this. We're back. continuing our discussion here on armed teachers in schools. We're going to give you an opportunity to weigh in. If you want to find us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter, you can do that. You can also email me with questions and comments for our guest at lynn@lynndoyle.net. We'll pass that along to them. Thomas has written in and says, I never thought I would feel this way, but with the way things are today, yes, with proper training, I would support arming the teachers. Pamela, though, she doesn't agree. She says maybe what we should do is take the crazed people off the streets and hold their families accountable for not reporting them. The government will throw you in jail for a little weed, but they let the crazy people walk the streets. What's wrong with this picture?
Wow.
And that goes back to my question before the break. How do these people get a hold of these kinds of weapons? And that goes back to the whole gun control issue again. The whole thing is just a catch-22. And I have. I can't tell you how many hundreds of shows in 17 years I've done on gun control.
And I would love to get into that discussion, but I mean, you know,
next time.
Let's take it back to the base. You made a really good point in the last segment about how, you know, school districts don't have the resources. Well, let's step back and talk about how the resources are being spent and not being spent well. The city of Philadelphia and the city of New York both have school safety officers. In Philly, they call them school police, even though they're not Act 120 and not certified police officers. We're paying for these. So the question I have to pose to the panel is, if Baltimore City and Detroit could afford legitimate, certified school police departments, how come the bigger cities can't, forcing this question on teachers who may not want to be armed or have to have that responsibility to begin with?
If you want to talk about cost, one of the things that you want to take into consideration, and this has come up around the country as people are trying to decide what to do with Newtown, insurance companies are threatening to drop school districts and not cover them if they arm their teachers. They have actuaries, they have folks looking at the numbers and saying, this will cost us too much money to cover these school districts because it's a threat, an accident, a suicide.
I was just going to say, when a teacher accidentally shoots a child or another teacher or trying to apprehend a gunman, I can see where that would cause some major issues.
An armed security guard in Michigan earlier this year went to the bathroom, forgot his gun on the sink, and a student found it.
And Debbie, before we go, because we're almost out of time, and I invite you all to come back so that we can continue this discussion on a future show. But do you think that there's also going to be a socioeconomic aspect to this if we allow teachers to be armed?
I don't think, I most certainly know that that's what's going to happen. Let's be honest, the Philadelphia School District has no money. We, for all intents and purposes, rely on the state for whenever they feel like throwing us a crumb. So we're going to be the last in their line of getting any money to do anything. Our kids barely have books.
They can barely get the school
started. And they can
started.
barely get books to take home. They're not going to have the money they need to get trained, well-trained school resource officers.
But I keep putting it back here. They have no money because they're misspending the money. The Philadelphia School District, the school police, which aren't really police and don't have arrest authority, have a fleet of new Explorers with transport cages and LED light bars, which most police departments don't have in America. So where are they getting the money to buy that?
In most of these inner city schools, though, the students know the school police officers by name. They're more inclined to go to that school police officer and talk about that problem than they would a teacher or their social workers or whatever they call them.
Why not make them a real police officer for the same money?
Because they don't need it.
We know students are safer in the schools than they are out of school. And we need to make sure that the bad people keep the guns from getting in their hands in the first place.
Last thought, Robert?
Well, we're talking about let's keep the guns out of the schools. And it's more of an issue of let's find out who these people are that are going to carry out these attacks before they do.
So you agree with one of our viewers who said, let's try to keep an eye on these people that have the potential to be harmful. I want to thank you so much. I'm sorry we're out of time, but I do want to thank you all for being with us very much. A great discussion. If you were unable to get through and you want to email me, you can do that at lynn@lynndoyle.net. Until the next time, my thanks to my crew and to you for watching. Good night.